The opinions expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers nor Rogers TV.
Hi, welcome to Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Dave Szollosy. The Ontario Liberal Party took quite a beating in the last provincial election, dropping from a majority government down to electing only 7 members. A lot of that drubbing was blamed on former Liberal leader Kathleen Wynne, who has stepped down. On March 3rd, Ontario Liberals will be electing a new leader. Joining me today to discuss the candidates and the fortunes of the Liberal Party in the province of Ontario is my esteemed political panel. Cynthia Wellesley Esquimalt is a 2-time previous Liberal federal candidate. Jillian Vivona, former president of the Vaughan Woodbridge Liberal Riding Association. And Phil Craig, actor, owner of Liberation Tours, and former Ward 2 councillor in Georgina. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming to this.
You're welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
It's great. Well, I want to start right into it because we've got a question I want to pose to get us going. It comes out of the latest poll. Polaris Strategic Insights, in their latest survey of the population, have the Liberals at 33%, the Conservatives at 29%, and the NDP at 27%, with the Greens at 9%. So the Liberals are doing better now without a leader than they did in the election. Does it even matter at this point in time who gets elected?
Absolutely. Absolutely it matters, because it's the leader that is going to help to bring a vision, build a vision. And so this is being looked at now as the golden opportunity to rebuild, to decide from a grassroots level where the Liberal Party is going to go here provincially. And so the individuals that are stepping up to capture and take on that role are very, very important at this time.
Or would it not be better to hide in the closet and let the Conservative Party self-destruct with Ford out front? Well, which is apparently what they're doing on the polls, right?
Well, isn't that what the Conservative Party strategy was in the last provincial election?
But they can't hide him forever.
Well, they had, for the longest time, no leader, and they never came out with a policy, yet they were able to win a majority government, just allowing the government to fall.
Well, that was the circumstances at the time, I think, because of people had a bad taste about the previous leader. But I think this time a leader is really important, and a leader that knows something about the environment, that's willing to stand up to a lot of the issues that are going on across the country, even though they're in the province. This province right now, we're talking about Ontario, right across the country, there's a lot of things going on that I think we need a strong leader for. So it's very important who it is.
Mm. So what would you ascribe, the current polling numbers to? Like, why? I think, Phil, you were starting to allude to that. Why are we seeing the polls?
I'd like to stay on that topic.
well, let's explore for a while. Right now, I mean, the majority government is running neck and neck, or third or second in the polls. Why is that situation developed that right now it looks like the province is looking for anybody?
Well, it puts me personally in a little bit of a dilemma, because normally I would come on here and I would talk about disinformation and the inability of people to make up their minds given, what policies are being put in front of them. In this situation, I'm kind of enjoying what's happening. It seems as if the press are, in fact, getting some of the information out about what is happening. Certainly the internet seems to be getting out information about the policies of the Ford government is undertaking, and so
it's kind of obvious too, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, with the whole question of education, teachers on strike in practically every place you go, obviously there's some clear dissatisfaction with what this government has decided to do. And I agree. I think that education and children are the most important thing that we have. And if we're not going to support our kids through school, and we're going to create these larger classes or put them online, where they don't have the support of their peers, or they don't have teachers actually helping them and instructing them, then what's going to happen to their education, and where will they be 10 years from now?
We can stay on this for a second here. Let's go ahead, Phil.
I was just going to say, but the question is, in terms of the numbers, is this disaffected swing voters that were Liberal supporters, then went to Conservative to protest and are now coming back into the Liberal camp?
Well, I think
who's making up this base?
What you have to remember is that every election is about emotion. People vote with their emotions. Yeah. And I think the Conservatives proved that point because they didn't have a platform.
Right.
So if you don't have a platform and you become a majority government, I can't see that the population of Ontario were voting for the Conservatives as much as they might have been voting against the Liberals. And so there was this sort of bleed out into the NDP, hence their numbers became so much more significant, but not enough to take the government. Right. And there was this swing to the Conservatives on a level that gave them a majority government. So herein now is, this is what you voted for. Surprise. We're going to attack autism. We're going to be cutting funds for infrastructure. We're going to say we're going to do all these things, but in the reality of it, in a world of social media where communication is critical as well as language, people are not so easily fooled when the dust settles. The dust has settled and the lights are on, and there's no more hiding in dark corners, and now we're seeing the reality of decision-making that was based on an emotion. In all of the conversations I was having during the last election, I'm sure you were having them too, it was like, but who are people voting for? They're angry with Kathleen Wynne, but I really was at a loss to understand why. What was it particularly? We parsed all that out in the debrief of the post-election. But at the time, it was just such an intense emotional piece. And I think people may be a little bit more thoughtful. I hope.
We hope so.
So to continue that, are you saying then that there are two reasons why the Conservatives have slipped in the polls? One is, in fact, the policies that they have followed since forming the government. And secondly, there's the, oh my God, ha ha ha, is he still the leader factor? Is that where you're going?
Well, absolutely. I mean, let's not underestimate the persona. So the talking points that are brought to the table by the individuals who are doing the talking, I'm not sure that we would see that if it was the leader who was coming out. And so now, when it comes down,
what you're just saying. The talking points, you mean like things like the Education Minister Lecce and stuff?
Absolutely. Yeah. So he's become the point person.
Yeah.
And if you know, I was looking at, I've forgotten which program it was now, but it was one of those satire programs. And they kept saying, defer to, I defer to. And every question that was asked to the Premier by the Leader of the Opposition was, I defer to this minister, I defer to that minister. He never once took that on, whereas if you see in other levels of government, the Leader of the party has no problem stepping up
taking responsibility
and wanting to be that voice.
If they're in the House,
Yeah, and yet I'm still not seeing amongst the Conservatives that I know, and admittedly there's not that many of them in my group of friends, but I'm still not seeing amongst them a sort of humility to say, we made a mistake in the last election. We made a mistake. I'm not seeing that at all.
I don't think you're going to see that at all anyway.
And yet the polls are saying that that's what's happening.
The polls are saying that, but that's because they're talking to people, lots of people that from a diversity of backgrounds. So I don't think that the Conservatives are saying, we're not supportive of this or we don't like what's going on. Even Carolyn Mulroney, the MPP for here, I mean, she just steps right out. Look what happened in Hamilton. She just stepped right out of it and had to have a police escort out of the city because she was too afraid to confront the people that had questions for her. So, that whole question of passing on the buck and not being able to respond to these very significant issues, I think is very important. And the Liberal Party, I just think they just didn't bother coming out. So now they've got something to come out for, and hopefully they'll do that and they'll actually vote.
Before we go on, I just want to raise one other thought, though, because we do hear echoes, in contrast to what you were saying, Phil, of supporters of Doug Ford say, well, this is what he promised to do, and he's doing it. We need to cut back the, it's always very hyperbolic in the expression of the enormous amount of debt the Liberals had put us into over the years, and we had to rein that in, and this is what Ford is doing.
Fake news, yeah. But yeah, which is interesting because, you would expect, and I don't want to get into American politics, but you'd expect to see, when Romney stood at the Senate and gave the presentation that he did about the reasons to impeach the president. I had thought to myself,
he was the only Republican
the only Republican to vote in favor of removing the president. And I thought, given the tenor of the speech, that certainly there would be other swing Republicans or those that are just sitting on the fence that would be pushed by the passion from which he spoke to go with a truth. And that's why I was speaking a moment ago about my conservative friends not changing their minds. It seems like we're in a place where there is such divisiveness, such a lack of humility, and such disinformation that it's...
Well, it's scary. Let's just say
it's scary.
It's
scary.
But we live in a black and white world.
Yeah.
That's
becoming more so polarized.
And it's very much
very polarizing.
very much extremes, and the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. And every once in a while, it never actually really stops in that centerpiece. It goes from one end to the other. So we've seen this large extreme, and I think, as I said, the dust has settled, the lights are on, and people went, "Well, that was interesting." Now is the hard reality of living the decision that we have made.
Yeah.
Well, and there may be a lot of people who don't want to take or are unable to take responsibility for that decision.
Yeah. Before we get into the conversation on the candidates themselves, I want us to have a quick overview of the process that the Liberal Party uses to elect a leader. I know this idea of leadership convention is very unique to Canada in the Westminster democracies, but every party has its own method. How are the Ontario Liberals going about this?
This was a very grassroots process. So for many, many months, in particular, one of the candidates, Stephen Del Duca, he's been for at least a year traveling around the province and connecting with individuals. And it basically comes down to membership in the party. So once everything was parsed out as to what happened in the debrief and where do we want to go from here, and Stephen had made the decision, you know what, I want to bring us into this new Liberal paradigm. And what will that look like? Well, I'm going to go out and I'm going to talk to the people in this province. He's been all around the province, as I'm sure all the candidates should have been. And he'd been doing that for many, many months. And so it's about what we call getting the memberships to happen. And then from
all the candidates have been signing up new members.
And bringing in the fundraising. Yeah. So you're not going to underestimate the leader's got to be someone who can raise money for the party, because that's how campaigning happens.
That's how how does that translate into the actual voting now for the leader?
Well, we just this weekend had our delegate selection. So delegates will be going to the convention in March, and the way that works is there are 16 delegates per riding, and then there is a percentage of those delegates that are captured by each candidate, and so how
does that capturing happen? I'm unclear on that.
The way that it happens particularly is the vote occurs in two parts. There are the 6 candidates listed. The member, you have to be a Liberal Party member by a certain deadline and that kind of a thing. You come in, you vote for a candidate, and then you can vote for up to 16 delegates to represent that individual as you see fit, and then depending on the number of boxes that are checked for the candidate, that will determine if I was running and I got 50% of those boxes checked, I would get 50% of the delegates. So now it comes down to, of the delegates who've been checked off, I would get 8. And so representing Vaughan Woodbridge would be 8 delegates for Jillian Vivona. They would then go to the convention, and there's first round vote. Once the first round vote happens, if there's no decided leader, then comes the jockeying of getting
so they're only tied to the vote for the first round?
Correct.
Okay, Phil, in the last minute.
How does that process differ, and how is that process better than the process used by the NDP or the Conservative Party?
I'm not personally familiar with how they do it. What resonates with me is that it begins with the grassroots knocking on the door. It begins with connecting with the individuals, so everybody actually has a voice. You come and you vote. You have your conversations. They've had multiple leadership debates. In fact, there's one next week as well.
And you're going to have to catch you right here. We're going to have to go to a break. Stay with us as we come back to talk about the leadership race in the Ontario Liberal Party. And that was great. Thank you very much for that. Hi, thanks for staying with us on Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. Today we're talking about the Ontario Liberal leadership race, and I'm joined by an expert panel. I want to start talking in this session about York Simcoe itself. And we were talking even before that the riding association in York Simcoe doesn't appear very viable at the moment. And coming in a distant third in the last provincial election, can the party locally here, despite what we've been saying earlier, put forth a viable challenge?
I don't see why not. I mean, federally, they weren't strong in the riding association. Provincially, I'm not sure, but I think we have enough time to be able to work that up and be a viable comer in this particular election. I don't see why not. But the problem is, again, getting people back interested in what's going on and actually taking up those issues and saying, I want to see change, I want to see something done. We've got lots on the table, right? The water issue, and they've asked Karen Mulroney to do something about it, and she's just sort of stayed away from it. So Lake Simcoe is a really important piece for everybody around the lake, and there's got to be better than 1 million people now living around the lake.
And as you well know, you can speak to the strength with which the Chippewas of Georgian Island have been pushing that issue around the water.
Well, they've been pushing that they don't want the new treatment plant to be dumping Toronto water in Lake Simcoe. And even though the water is supposedly treated, it's still going to be wastewater that's treated and then dumped into Lake Simcoe. And really, the community feels like if you've got water coming from Toronto, dump it in Lake Ontario where it's been dumped before. So that's a strong issue that people are fighting against. So the Conservatives that I know have said, yeah, go ahead. But a lot of the Liberals that I know said, we don't want it. We don't want the water.
You raised an interesting question there, and that's the amount of communication between the parties and the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations. And is there a meeting process going on, or is it a continuation? Because I remember when I was on council, that was the one thing when we found out the Chippewas hadn't even been consulted.
Right.
Were never brought into the process.
Yes.
Is that happening? Is that something
Yes.
that the Liberal Party specifically can address better than the Conservative Party?
Well, I think
Notice I didn't say the NDP.
The community itself is actually taking a stand and actually making sure that people are aware of what the circumstances are. They're actually hosting gatherings themselves to talk to people, and I don't think they're saying you can only come if you're liberal or you can only come if you're conservative. They're saying we have to address this issue. We want people in the community in the riding to know something about it, and so we're hosting those events so that they have an opportunity to have a say on what goes on. But this is a typical thing. I mean, we were talking earlier about the Wet'suwet'en piece and the fact that the First Nations, some of them were called to the table, but the traditional chiefs weren't. So they're the ones that are.
We're talking about the cause of the land blocking, the
in Ontario,
construction blocking in British Columbia.
Yeah, and Tyendinaga in Ontario. Right.
In sympathy with the land occupation.
Exactly.
In BC,
But I'm just saying, coming back to what he said, the fact of the matter is the Chippewa were not invited to the table when the initial conversations went on, and so they have stood staunchly against it, not because of that, but since they learned about it. But we're going to see more of this happening across the country because people have a right to know, and if it's their lands or territories that are in question, then they're going to want to come to the table. And I think that's an important thing because Indigenous peoples are now voting. And that's a pretty big vote in some of these ridings, especially the Aurelius riding and our riding too. Our people vote.
So you were also talking earlier with regards to York Simcoe in particular that the demographics of the riding is changing.
They're shifting
because of the increasing subdivisions going in, the traditional respite of being a conservative empire is falling away, getting less than 50%. Is the Liberal Party going to be able to fill that gap? And Phil, you're giving me a funny look.
Well,
you don't
because
agree with that assumption?
because I think there's a difference between the old sort of slow rural conservatism and the modern, I got a big truck, I can move faster than you conservatism. You know, it's a much more active, it's a more volatile conservatism, and it's probably more likely to give you a finger that you don't want to look at than there used to be conversation. There used to be discussion in that old rural conservatism with the rural liberals. There used to be discussion.
No, there isn't.
But
And now there isn't. Now there's divisiveness.
Part of that, I think, is because of the nature of the way conservatism has changed. When was the last time we saw a real progressive conservatism in a conversation? It became this big capital C where it was authoritarian and dictatorial and my way or the highway, which has never been a favor of mine in any kind of political realm. And I think the bleed out into the Conservative Party, in spite of the fact they didn't have a platform, and now in spite of the fact that they are implementing policies that they never actually spoke about, which mind-boggling to me, because did we not just play that record for several years in the federal realm?
Right.
And then we're going to go and do it exactly the same way. Why anybody was surprised and shocked and mortified with the policies that were being implemented, and now I think that bleed is coming back into a more centrist position, which would be the Liberal Party.
And why are we seeing those issues reflected more and more so here? But certainly, if you look south of the border and you look over to Britain and the Brexit vote, and the policies that the Johnson government are bringing into play now, you know, the continued cutting of funds.
And programs. I want to shift this again a little bit for a moment, because right now there's two by-elections going on in Ontario. Two of the 7 Liberal MPPs had retired, and so the by-elections are taking place. How much is that going to play into the Liberal leadership race or debate? Is it part of the conversation? If the Liberals can't regain those seats, will that reflect badly on the incumbent members or members of the previous Liberal government to look to a more radical, different approach in electing a leader? Or does it matter?
Often, by-elections are seen as barometers of public opinion, and people will take the risk to say, this is what we think on this particular area, but if it was a broader general election, I think it's going to be a much different conversation. So they may be sending a message by how they vote, but let's face it, the Liberal Party is coming back into the fold. That's what they need to do. So the focus needs to be on the rebuilding of the party and whose vision, whose leadership is going to be able to bring that to a place where people will say, yes, I can believe in the Liberals again. Yes, that's the party that reflects me. That's the person leading the party who reflects who I am, what my values are. Because I think whether you are Conservative or NDP or Liberal, you want to have good education for your children. What does that look like and how you get there? That's the differences in the conversation. You want to have adequate, more than adequate, you want to have excellent health care. When you go to the hospital, no one's asking you to show you their political card. What party do you belong to? They want to see your health card. And you want to know that you're going to receive those services regardless. So there are commonalities for people all over Ontario, and you need to have someone who can resonate with individuals into how they're going to meet the expectations.
Cynthia was
But I was not only that though, but as you're saying, with everything being cut, and people are now feeling those cuts, I think they're also going to be looking for a leader like part of the problem is the Liberals have been cast as spend. And so that's what people were concerned about.
And very successfully in that last provincial election.
That was clearly what people were saying. And I don't think we want a leader that is spend or cut. Somehow, this leader has to be able to speak to that center. That's got to be able to talk. They've got to be able to talk about environment in a very positive and very consistent way, which hasn't happened in all of these things. The whole question of reconciliation is still on the table. People are still talking about it, and they have to be able to talk about that. And we're now find ourselves in a place where that's clearly not on the table, or people are very angry about it.
And how does a Liberal leader in Ontario talk about environment and the necessity of leaving oil in the ground? How does that leader talk with the province of Alberta?
Well, this is the great segue into the next question I want to ask, and we have to address. So when we're looking at a leadership figure, a leader, what qualities is the membership of the party looking for to make themselves relevant to the people of Ontario once again and electable?
Well, they better be really good communicators, because that's one of the biggest issues I have with all of this is the comms that people have are terrible. So people don't really know what's going on, and they have to know. This person has to have some dignity. They have to be consistent, with their messaging. They have to have some strong policy options available to people to look at. I think this leader is going to have to work like double time to really pull the Liberal Party back up to where it needs to be, and to really represent what's going on across the country. They have to be strong.
They also have to be very balanced.
Yes.
So it's got to be someone who's experienced enough in politics, has a breadth of portfolios to be able to understand the nuances of municipal issues, provincial issues, federal issues, international issues, and how they all play onto the political scene, the economic scene, the social scene for Ontario, and be able to bring all those pieces together. Those are a lot of balls to be juggling up in the air and not let anything happen, and to know the people around you. So they've got to be a listener. That's one of the things that was a takeaway, was that the party wasn't listening. So this person has got to be able to listen, inspire support, inspire confidence, because we are now in a culture of fear, and there are so many pressures for mistrust. I don't know that there's anybody out there who could say, apart from maybe us at the table here, that we have trust in the system, or we can have trust in politicians. It's a general negativity. So that person's got to be able to break through that and say, I'm not going to make fancy promises. I'm not going to lie to you the way that the individuals in this government have been doing on a daily basis. But what I am going to tell you is that I have the same values that you do, in that I want my children to go to a good school. I want them to have clean water. I want them to have good health care. I want to see that for all children in this province. And who is that person who's going to be able to bring that scope together? They need to be relatable. They need to be personable, but they also need to be able to withstand what we know is going to be an onslaught of rhetoric and negativity and firestorm that's going to come from the Conservative Party.
Well, you brought up the word dignity. I think it's a great word, and to see, for instance, the Conservative leader in Alberta, Kenny, the day after the election, instead of a congratulations and now we'll get to work, coming out with an aggressive, we're going to hit this on the head. There's going to be no conversation. This is a demand, and that's where we stand. How do you get a public to recognize that they need to have dignified leaders and not aggressive leaders like Kenny?
And also a sense of humanity, because that's also missing these days. People having a sense of being a human being with everybody else and being like everybody else. I mean, listening to Mr. Ford talk, with that sort of bravado and, I'm better than everybody else kind of. I mean, people don't want that. I mean, there's a lot of people that I speak to that look at that as just being pretty kind of almost phony. Why are you even, wanting to be the leader and you're behaving that way? So that's a really important piece as well. I think we're looking for a leader that represents the people. I'm not talking about the middle class. There's a lot of people that are in the, what would be regarded as the underclass, I suppose, that actually have a right to be heard.
And that's an increasing segment of the population as well.
So they have a right to be heard. I don't think it's a matter of breaking us into segments and saying, you belong in this class, and this class, and that class. I mean, the whole question of the guaranteed income piece that Ford canceled the moment he got in, that was actually helping a lot of people. And mothers were able to get cars, and they were able to go back to school. They were able to go to work. It just made it really difficult for a lot of people when that got cut. And
especially
I think
ones who had planned
on having this for 3 years or whatever it was, to be able to sort of lift themselves up. And if we can't lift up the population, what are we doing? I mean, that's who's important here is just regular people who are going about their lives, trying to ensure that their children have an education, trying to ensure that they have a roof over their heads. He lifted off the rent controls, so now people are losing their places because they're being told you know they can't afford the rent that they were in the place that they were staying in. And where are you going to find something? What about all of the young people that we have out there right now? They're not able to get work and they're not able to get a living wage. They cut that. Because they were going to lift
but the party quotes the Fraser Institute, and everybody goes, "Oh my goodness, that must be the truth. That must be the Bible. It's the Fraser. They said it.
But I want to
we
come
have
back.
to believe it."
I want to come back
And
to a
we're
point.
not going to be able to come back to that point just now. Can we come back to that point after
Yes,
the break?
yes.
Okay, remember that. Stay with us, please. We have to go for a quick break. We'll come back and we'll talk about the individual leadership candidates as well. Hi, and welcome back to Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. I'm your host, Dave Szollosy, and tonight we're talking about the Liberal leadership candidates, and the conversation keeps going hot and heavy during the break here. You should have heard what we were talking about before. But, Jillian, you were trying to make a point before we went to break, and I want to go back to you first.
Yes, please, because I want to come back to a point that Cynthia had made earlier, which was it appears like this dichotomy between spend and cut, when actually it isn't. What it needs to be, and we saw this with the last Liberal government, was that it was invest. And so anyone who's purchased a house knows that you're going to have debt. It's called a mortgage. And unless you are independently wealthy, where you've paid off your entire house and car and your credit cards and you're never in debt, you are in debt. But those debts are an investment. So we need a leader who can communicate that piece, that you're not. It's not a necessity to not spend. In fact, you do need to spend, but it's how you spend. Spend wisely. And so that we're not looking at cutting what our government's doing now, which is cutting revenues and then saying, oh, we don't have any money, so now we have to cut this. We have to cut teachers. We have to cut nurses. We can't spend on this. We can't maintain our infrastructure because we have no money. Well, yeah, you cut all the revenues. We don't have a deficit problem. Yeah. We have a revenue problem here in Ontario, and that was created by the Conservative Party.
But even with the
Okay, I'd like us to get, in this segment, I really want us to get into talking about the individual leadership candidates now, so people know some of the names that we're referring to.
Okay.
We've already mentioned a couple times Stephen Del Duca. He's kind of right now seen as the front runner, I think, in this leadership race. The initial delegate selection, I think, suggests that overall more than half of the elected delegates from that round is committed to Del Duca. He's raised more money than any of the other candidates, $227,000. Is he the kind of individual that meets the description we were just talking about of what the membership should look for in a provincial leader?
I would say absolutely, and I'm fully supporting Stephen. He is the MPP in our riding. I've known him for many, many years since we moved to the riding.
Was an MPP. He's not currently. He lost the last
In my mind,
election.
he'll always be the MPP. But
he doesn't hold a seat. That's one of the criticisms against him.
Correct.
He doesn't hold a seat in the House.
But that doesn't mean you can't be active, and that doesn't mean that everything that he brings to the table doesn't shine far and above. And so he has the experience from when he was very young. He's held several portfolios. And one of the things about Stephen is that he brings that dignity to the conversation. I've, in fact, have never actually seen Stephen in all the years I've known him. And in all of the functions that we've attended, I've never seen him lose his temper. That doesn't mean he doesn't get angry. But I've never actually seen him be triggered where he will lose that persona of being a dignified person. And that there's going to be a lot of pushing in the next election to make him do that. He's not going to get
And what about him carrying any
into
negative baggage from the Wynne area?
Yeah.
Well,
he was part of that.
Is that going to be a problem for him?
Well, here's the thing. You need to look at the individual and what he accomplished. And within that government, his scope of being able to have accomplished what he did as Minister of Transportation, extending for this area the 404 up to Keswick. It goes all the way up.
Yeah,
there.
right to Ravenshire here. And that was really important for the future economic development plans for Georgina.
Being a part of the development in Vaughan, bringing the 400 up, building a hospital, just for our riding alone. And it's reflective of the things that were supported in the province. Schools, the hospital, all of the things that resonate with every individual in Ontario, the things that we were talking about earlier that people need to have. He brings that balance, and he is a listener. He is that person who will not only just bring his vision to the table, but he will allow that vision to blossom and grow with the input from those around him. And that's really, really important. People want to be heard. In my role, what I do on a daily business is really it's listening to people. If someone calls me up to have a conversation about X, Y, or Z, really, I may not be able to help them resolve their issue, but they feel better because they got heard. Stephen does that, but he communicates really well. He has the ability to inspire.
Phil, does that translate provincially? Or?
Well, I just worry about whether the party doesn't need somebody that doesn't come from a previous era, that the mud can't be slung at, and those that are right now, as we have heard from the polls, who are sort of indicating they might be willing to change, would look and say, oh, well, it's old world again. We're back to the same old, and we got rid of her.
But that's going to be the criticism,
which is always which is always going to be a danger, I think. And if you're in politics and you're a lifelong political person, you're going to be possibly stuck with other things. I know Michael Couteau. I don't know Del Duca, but I do know Michael Couteau, and I think he also has a sense of dignity. And he, the reason I know him and I've actually met him and had conversations about him is because of the work he's done in child welfare. And I'm not a social worker, but I've spent a lot of my time and energy worrying about kids and working with kids and mentoring kids and also dealing with the child welfare issues that are federally important. They send the money out into the communities, and the agencies are the ones who are responsible, and the provinces are responsible. So the province, his work as an MPP has been very centered around that particular issue, which is important to me. And I think that out of that comes education and all the other pieces that we're concerned about. And I think he's doing quite well in this race, and he's come up and spoke to the community. So he's got some interest in the riding as well, and he's got some interest in what's going on across Ontario.
He actually did. He was in Georgina.
Yes, he was.
The other day, canvassing out on the fish huts, I believe.
Yeah, wow. Which is pretty unsafe.
Good
but anyway,
I want to come back to Michael in a minute.
Okay.
But there's one other thing before we leave Stephen Del Duca, I was noticed with interest, if people know the Facebook page Ontario Proud. It's obviously backed by the Conservative Party supporters, according to a Toronto Star report.
Okay.
It's come out on this Toronto Star report that it's Ontario Proud is behind the Facebook campaign, the Anybody But Del Duca Facebook page. So, and I went over it, and it was, to be quite honest, found the criticisms pretty lame. They dealt with vague references. He has special interests. He makes backroom deals. Yeah, I should throw that out, but I mean, not without saying anything. The big scandal that did quote is that he billed the Liberal Party $785 for a dinner meeting at High Steakhouse, and I'm going, really? That's the biggest scandal you can come up with. Which I know you're having a dinner meeting. That's not that unusual.
There's always going to be criticism.
So why are the Conservatives afraid of him becoming Liberal leader? Is the question that comes into my mind.
Well, because he's
if they're putting this
strong enough to. Yeah, he's probably strong.
It's obvious. He's obviously strong enough to take on Ford and beat him. Absolutely. And he's got that confidence. He's got that ability to do the fundraising. And he has that capacity to resonate with Ontarians across the province. And I'll tell you why. He has two lovely little daughters, 12 and 8. And they are the reason that he is doing this, because he wants to have an Ontario that is going to be healthy and strong and growing economically, clean environment, that there's a future for his children, not unlike parents across this province, no matter where you live. that's what you want to have. It's the future. And so for Stephen, in all of his talking points, he resonates most strongly with education. If we're going to have a clean environment, we have to have education that leads us to that technology. We need to educate our children for that future in technology, whether it is green energy, windmills, solar panels, electric stations, charging stations across the province.
For electric cars, you mean, yeah.
For electric cars, that there is, if you remember, it was the Liberal Party that passed the legislation to protect the Oak Ridges Moraine. And the first thing, you want to talk about backdoor deals, we see Ford in a room, and he's trying to cut a deal. Yeah, no problem. You know, big party developers who contribute a lot lot of money. We'll allow that to slide. We'll open up that exactly.
But so is part of this election then not only about, I mean, Stephen Del Duca, Michael Couteau, or any of these other candidates, they have to be strong enough to fight Ford. But at the same time, are we not opening the books on what Ford's doing as well? I mean, a little bit more and communicating. I mean, a lot of people just don't seem to understand that they're going to be directly affected in their family ultimately by what Ford is doing, even if they don't feel it right now.
They are now, though. They are now.
So we need to talk about that as well.
And let's talk about Michael Couteau for a bit. Now, in any kind of delegated convention, the second place person is always a really, really key position to go into the convention on, because if there is such a thing as anybody but Del Duca movement that has any momentum, questionable at this point in time that it's real. But second place is always really key. He's raised $165,000. It's not shabby as well, and has a large number of delegates committed. Phil, he goes back to something you were addressing in particular. He seems to be stronger on these references to climate and climate change. He addresses that, talking about climate change as an urgent existential threat. He's the only one that's really talking about opposing water extraction, the Nestle campaign. Is he going to resonate with more of the grassroots members then, or is that not where Ontario sees itself looking towards in the next election campaign?
Well, when you say resonate with the grassroots members, I mean you're a Liberal talking to a Liberal, and we're even left of them, you and I. But they will talk about environmental issues. They will talk about minimum wage. They will talk about guaranteed annual income, all the progressive programs, and within the party. Who's going to be able to carry those arguments outside of the party? That's what I need, and that's why, which goes back to the thing I was asking before about electability. And if you're carrying baggage, no matter how well-intentioned you are, no matter how deeply you believe in the issues that we all see as being relevant and important, how can you carry it out to the public? How do you get it out there if they can slam a simple thing against you that will reduce your voting impact? I'm afraid of that.
I haven't had the opportunity, unfortunately, I've been on the road a lot, to actually hear people speak. Yeah, so I think that's a good indicator as well. If who's a strong speaker, because that's really important as well. That's what sways people a lot. They're persuaded as opposed to bullied into sometimes being electing, but they're persuaded, and I think that's an important part of this conversation. And I unfortunately can't speak to that, but maybe one of you guys can. I mean, I know you know that Stephen Del Duca is you obviously support him.
Excellent speaker.
And I've heard Michael speak only briefly, so I don't know if anybody, either one of you.
No, I don't. But as you were talking, I was reflecting back to what the Conservatives went through when they put Doug Ford in charge, and I wouldn't ever say that good speaking was something that he would carry the day on.
So here's my question to you: is that Phil, how badly did all of the tagging of the heresiers affect the Ford government and getting in. It actually really didn't, did it?
No, I don't think it
Everyone
did,
kept
actually.
saying this is Harris Part 2, and all of his people around him were just coming out from the Harris years, and they were going to, try to get another, and they got in with a majority. So
But
I'm
Jillian,
not
we're much
sure.
closer to the last Liberal government than the last election was close to the Harris
Yeah.
government. There was a bigger gap of time there. A lot of people were voting for the first time didn't remember.
They didn't
the
know,
Harris
they hadn't
years.
experienced it.
They're experiencing it now.
They're experiencing it now, yeah.
They are.
So the
People get the
couple
leadership they
seconds,
deserve, I guess,
The
yeah.
fact that Coutueau's the only current MPP that's running, is that a plus or is that a negative? Does that keep him tarred with the way Phil's suggesting, or does that give him a?
No, Mitzi Hunter's
Mitzi Hunter's also
Oh,
an
Missy
MPP.
Hunter. Sorry.
Mitzi
Thank
Hunter's
you for
also
correcting me.
in,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you for correcting me.
I think it's helpful that they're MPPs because obviously they're in government, they have an understanding of how it works, and I think that that's also really important. That and I mean, Stephen has obviously been in before as well, so they have an understanding.
I would hazard to say it might be more important if we were a party that had a larger political voice in the House.
Yeah,
So when
of
you're the
course.
third party, you don't get as much of
Yeah.
a chance to speak as you would like to.
True.
And so I think that I'm not going to say that that's going to be the deal breaker for
No,
me.
no.
And we're going to have to cut it there then too. So the MPP isn't roll. Stay with us. We got a little bit of summing up to do on this edition of Politically Speaking. Hi, and welcome back to Politically Speaking, Insights and Issues. We are having a lively conversation tonight on the Liberal leadership race. And I want us getting into with our panel, before we wind up, we have to talk about a couple of the other candidates running. I want to bring up London candidate, one-time London candidate, Kate Graham. She finished third in her election. She calls herself an outsider, beyond the insular walls of Queen's Park. Is that a positive then in situation? Is that a negative? What carries on the conversation we're having? What she's kind of hoping, I mean, if we look at being the outsider coming in, that's how Dalton McGuinty won his leadership about 20 years ago or so.
That's how Trump won his leadership
coming
as
in
well.
from outside and garnering the supports that they weren't able to agree on the front runners, and so the third party candidate sneaks up.
It's what's happening in the States with, what's her name, Amy
Klobuchar.
Klobuchar. She's now the third, and she's coming up fast.
Yeah.
As she's a woman,
Well.
and she's an outsider.
But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
the big question will be is, during the general election, are you going to have what it takes to beat your opponent?
That's right.
And so that is got to be key
Yeah.
in everything. So having
yeah.
been at the leadership debates and listened to all of the candidates speak, I think they all have something to bring to the table. Whether or not I might agree with them is a different issue. They all bring something to the table, but who's got the best chance of becoming the leader of the party and then the
holding
next
it.
premier
And
of
holding it,
Ontario?
yeah.
Because Lord knows we need to have that change. This Conservative government has got to be a one-term government,
Yeah.
and I think that I'll admit it. I'm biased. I think that Stephen is that person.
Yeah. Well, I think that's fine. I think that we have to. I agree that we have to have the strongest person possible take this election. It's really important because you're right. I mean, all the stuff that's going on around this province has got to be brought back into order. And right now it's in disorder.
Which is why when you look at any political party, you question the party's ability to make a choice that is right for the party and right for the province or right for the country.
And right for
I'm sure there are a
everyone,
lot of conservatives
right?
sitting around right
Not-
now thinking,
Oh, good. Yeah.
how did I get us into this mess?
Yeah.
I can't go to Phil's anymore. He won't pour me any wine.
Well, this is the perfect segue into the question I think we have to close on. And I'm going to ask each of you, basically two questions. So who do you believe will win the Liberal Leadership Convention? And then with that person as Liberal leader, who will be the next Premier of the province? With that person against Andrea Horwath and Ford, what's going to happen in that provincial election? Where's the province heading?
Better start over there.
I'll start it off. I was hoping to get the last word in there, but I'll start
Well, I
it
don't
off.
mind going. If you want to, if you
Yeah,
want to go
go
last, I don't
ahead,
mind going.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Because I'll go as an NDP here. And I don't intimately follow the the choices that the Liberal Party has to make right now. And looking forward, obviously I'll be supporting Horwath in the next election and hoping that the issues and the policies that we speak to, that we try to get out there, are listened to.
Will they be able to maintain the momentum as the official opposition
Yeah.
and translate that into government?
Yeah, that's what I hope.
Despite obviously a rising support for the Liberal Party.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reaction that you're seeing in the United States with the Bernie Sanders campaign, which I think is a fantastic groundswell campaign, if that can be translated into votes, fantastic, because those are the ideas that we need to live by, that we can only go forward with environmentally positive ideas. There are so many great ideas that run against corporate thinking.
Yeah.
Corporate thinking and conservative thinking being, in my mind, the same thing.
Good. Cynthia, who's
So,
going to win Liberals? Who's going to win the next provincial?
Well, I don't want to name names because I'm just hoping for the best. May the best leader win, and that person has something to say about environment, something strong to say about that, something to say about people in general, not like the middle class or the upper class or lower, just people in general that need the support that they have to get to make sure their families are going forward in a good way, and that they talk about child welfare and they talk about the things that are important across the entire province. They talk about Indigenous issues and how are we going to solve these things, because that leader, whoever that is going to walk right into a very tense situation if that doesn't get resolved very soon, and it's going to grow. So I think that they have to have some strength there, and if they don't have that strength, I hope they're strong enough to go to some Indigenous leaders and get the help that they need to be able to solve it.
Thank you. And Gillian, you've got the last 2 minutes.
Thank you. I'm going to be a little bit more black and white, even though I would prefer the gray world, and that is that this province cannot afford another 4 years of a Conservative government under Ford. I think we all probably agree on that. For sure. I think that with all due respect to the efforts that Andrea Horwath has put in, I think the NDP had their shot. I think they've done as best as they can. And that the next leader of the Liberal Party will be Stephen Del Duca, and that he will take the Liberals to a successful election as Premier of the province, and he will begin right on day one with undoing the damage that has been done by this current government.
Fair enough.
Well said.
Yeah.
So you think that would be in a majority? You're predicting a majority government thing going in, or would they have to work closely? Would they have to work closely? Because right now, I mean, the polls are kind of indicating a preference from the populists have a three-way split.
Yeah.
Well, here we are now. We've got a whole year and a half to go yet.
Yes.
But I think again that's why Stephen is the right person, because we're all going to go. Every single party is going to go for a majority. They are. But at the end of the day, whatever transpires, the work has still got to be done for Ontarians.
Yes.
That's the focus. Exactly what you were saying, and he's that person who will do that.
Okay.
All right.
So we've got a
Sounds good.
forecast that Stephen Del Duca will win the leadership, and split on what's going to happen in the provincial election. Maybe we're going to have to come back together closer to that provincial election and to refine our prognostication.
Looking forward to it. Looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, the three of you. Cynthia, Phil, Gillian,
Thank
you very much for coming. Thank you very much for watching. This is Politically Speaking, and I'm your host, Dave Szollosy.